And at this point, I will pass it off to my wonderful co-host, Dr. Marnie Jull, who is program head of the Conflict Analysis and Management Program at Royal Roads University, to start us off with our acknowledgement of traditional lands. Marnie.
Thank you, Ariana. And so the elders who advise the Royal Roads University have really invited us to, while we recognize the formal part of the land acknowledgement and the importance, also to personalize it. And so I have been on these lands of the Lekwungen and the Quisepsum families and ancestors for about 6 years in my role at Royal Roads. And I feel really grateful that Royal Roads is a place where there have been thousands of years of people gathering with canoe protocols to be invited to become a part of the community in relationship with the land. And even now, as I'm looking out of my window and I see a tree, I'm reminded that I'm not making oxygen. So I do feel very grateful to be in relation to the lands. And it's always my intention when I do feel connected to the land and the history that I also think about when I think about the people that came before me. I also think about the people here in the room and then the people who are coming after me. And so acknowledge that I'm committed to developing a different relationship with these lands, as well as with the people who have been in connection with the lands, and in the hopes that it will create better and more sustainable relationships for everybody. Back to you, Ariana.
Thank you so much, Marnie. That was beautiful. I appreciate you. So of course, what we're all here for is our webinar today on engaging with the dilemmas of diversity in the workplace. Again, I'm very fortunate to be co-hosting with Marnie, as well as our guest speaker for today, Samantha Heron, who will introduce herself in just a moment. And of course, me, I'm Mariana Kanjurski, and I'm an education specialist at Royal Roads. I know originally on this program, of course, we were also excited to welcome Alejandro Campos Garcia to the conversation. Unfortunately, due to an unforeseen circumstance, he could not make it this afternoon, so we will be pleased to have him on a future webinar. So thank you all for still being here, and again, we'll hope to see you in future episodes of our series as well. Just a quick agenda before we go ahead and get started. Welcome. That's what we're doing now. And we'll get to our speaker introduction in just a moment, and then jump into our discussion on engaging with the dilemmas of diversity in the workplace. Any questions, as I mentioned, again, please feel free to pop them in the chat as we move along. And then at the very end, we'll give you a bit of information on our conflict analysis and management program. And if you have any questions, again, please. And at this point, I will pass it off to Samantha Heron to introduce herself. Samantha, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you. I very appreciate that introduction, and I'll explain a little bit more about myself. First of all, I have had the really amazing opportunity, given the way that my work looks over the last year and a bit, to be able to travel, work remotely, and live quite internationally. But that being said, I'm very grateful to be welcomed back into the space that I call home, which is the traditional and unceded territories of the Wasanic-speaking peoples. I was always amazed over the last bit of time traveling with the kindness and support I was greeted with in so many different locations, and that always especially rung true for me when I came back into the space that I live in as an uninvited guest and settler. So really important for me to acknowledge that. And then as I shift into the introduction of who I am, I'm also equally disappointed that Alejandro isn't here today, because I was looking forward to connecting with him, but I'm sure I will be able to hear some of the really incredible and important work that he has done. But if I reflect on myself, I usually say to people, as people ask, well, what do you do? It's a little bit of a monologue, and that's always what it feels like. I have a previous career working in the sports space, and for many years I was an athlete, and that led me to many different projects that allowed access to the disability sports space, as well as working on equity, diversity, and inclusion projects, just in, so many different research or community-based programming senses. But at the same time, I also completed my master's and graduated from the conflict analysis and management program. And that's led me to doing a lot of work in the sport maltreatment space right now, with some specific work in the alternative dispute resolution space. And so I oversee complaint management for a sport organization in Canada, but support organizations with many projects, and as well as do some individual mediations as people navigate conflict, largely in the sports space or the sport and recreation sector. And I have a real special interest in working in the disability and different abilities spaces, as well as supporting the role of females and female identifying individuals as they navigate the sports system. So that's a little bit of an overview of who I am, and I'm sure I'll connect to some specific pieces that I've done as we move through the program.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Samantha. It's really wonderful to have you here. At this point, of course, I will pass it off to Marnie and Samantha to have an engaging discussion on the topic. So I will stop sharing my screen and hand it off to you both. Thank you.
Thank you. And so to introduce myself a little bit more, I am the program head for the Conflict Analysis and Management program at Royal Roads University. And in that role, I am responsible for the student success from really beginning to end of how people enter and navigate their journey through conflict analysis and management program. And so I had the opportunity to meet Sam when she first thought about joining the CAM program, and really felt like there was something calling about the importance of engaging conscientiously with conflict. And then talking with her about her desire to do a thesis where she knew she wanted to grow into the role of consultant and expert. And it's been, the thesis really was the leverage to that. And it's been really wonderful to see how you've just taken that knowledge and now are really helping others in a very meaningful way. And so when we started to think about this series, Sam came to mind immediately to not only share who you are, but also to share the results of your really interesting research. So how I want to frame this conversation that Sam and I have both talked about is that as organizations, as people in organizations, whether we're community members or employees or leaders or students, we're called to engage with people who are diverse, called to be more inclusive. Sometimes it's us who are making that call. We recognize that there's limits and that there's voices that are being left out or excluded, or that our own voices are being stifled. And so in this call for more diversity and inclusion, and importantly around equity, the question then becomes, how do we engage with those dilemmas? How do we build the capacity for conflict that will inevitably come? Because when we invite difference, when we ourselves are different, conflict comes with that. And so I wanted to start that with the conversation of, from your research, Sam, if you could give a little bit of an overview of that, and then we can start into really how to navigate some of those dilemmas and the capacity to engage with conflict.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I'll share a couple of themes, and at some point they will connect together. So first of all, as I went through the CAM program, I made the really difficult decision of exploring the thesis track, because on one hand, it was this opportunity to really dive into specific research that was incredibly important for me at that time and continues to be important to me. At the same time, it meant that you lose a little bit of access to this wealth of other courses and offerings in the program. But as I navigated through my research, and specifically what my research was looking at the role of para-coach and administrators. And so a para-coach is somebody who is typically working in a Paralympic athlete stream or a Paralympic athlete space. So it was looking at the role of coaches and administrators navigating that system. And the overarching research question was, in what ways does fear and conflict show up in that role? And in looking through that work, what was really important to me was to apply the nested theory of conflict to that. And so that was understanding how our issues specific to our relational, to our subsystem and our system allow conflict to show up in different ways, and also really clearly links to how we show up in conflict based on all of those influences. At the same time, I also applied a difference between hierarchical, quite masculine styles of leadership against more shared feminine styles of leadership. And it was important to weave that into that space, given what I knew about the sport system and what I know about the sport system. And so as the research unfolded, what was very clear was how fear showed up and how fear was experienced by individuals, and that relation to the power dynamic that really exists in many of the systems that I'm sure all of us can kind of reflect on and go, yeah, I can see where it's hierarchical, or I can see where there are spaces where it can't be shared. And one of the things that is very powerful to me about working in the disability and different abilities sports space is how often it magnifies some of the issues that in the sports system, there's a lot of different ways to refer to, like the parasport space versus the classic or able-bodied sport space. For the purposes of this conversation, I'll go parasport versus like classic. And so the parasport space really magnified some of these conflicts. And this is where I'll, tie this question together. Is one of the key pieces is most of the decision makers identified as individuals without having a disability or while being able-bodied. And what was so apparent to that was the lack of consultation and the lack of legitimacy given to the very real experience and expertise that comes with a lived experience. And so one of the things that really connected with me in going through the research and then thinking about future work that I've been very grateful to engage in is we really struggle to do authentic consultation and authentic self-determination of the people who will most likely be impacted by this system, without recognizing that with some circumstances, oftentimes people really share a shared interest. And so it's almost like you chuckle to yourself as you take a step back and you look at a very basic sport example is people are generally interested in performing and winning. You would find it very difficult to find two people saying that's not their intent in engaging in a race or engaging in supporting performance along that lens. And yet we get into this highly conflictual space as we talk about how to do that. And we, forget to do that legitimate consultation that allows self-determination through a project. So I've shared a lot of things there, Marnie. I'll pause a little bit and understand, and ask where you want to pick up from.
Yeah. So, because when I heard you talking about the tension, first of all, just to go where you are with the consultation and how important it is to do the consultation, and how even if there may be this model of, we both share the same interest, that there may still not be an ability or even thinking about consultation. And I'm also wondering then what else you found that might that translates to other kind of leadership roles with dealing with that kind of the tension and dilemmas, really, because we know organizations are stronger, people are better, they're better able to perform when there's more diversity and we're open to that diversity, and yet there comes the challenge of conflict that comes with it.
Yeah, and the first places that come to mind with me in that sense, and a lot of it links to legitimacy, and a lot of it links to agency. And part of that is questioning, okay, who gives agency and who can put up their hand and take agency? And there's a lot of things that come into play as a result of our, I would say, like organizational frameworks that often limit agency. And so I'll first touch on legitimacy. And, when I reflect on myself and locating myself, first of all, in those spaces, I'm very clearly a person who is white. I have formal education. And I've always been grateful to be a part of some work opportunities that are very beneficial to me. And so I'm very aware that I walk into certain spaces with a huge amount of privilege. At the same time, what people don't know about me is that I am an individual who has a cognitive disability and has had to learn that later in life as it was acquired. And then you also navigate this space of this being a very invisible piece. And so then there are spaces where I'm incredibly well positioned to make recommendations or to engage in whatever framework we're developing based on, lived experience, the ability to hear and connect experiences from other people, and just a general skill set and interest I have in working in those spaces. But the legitimacy aspect of it, both for myself, based on the messages that we all consistently hear, as well as what you can expect an organization to be able to receive, really impact the places to make real recommendations in line and in step with the partners that you work with. And then if I take that back a step further and go, I can clearly see where I walk into spaces with privilege. Somebody who doesn't walk into that space with the same privilege is going to have very different and potentially much larger challenges going through that same agency piece and that same legitimacy piece.
Do you think of a specific example that comes to mind for you with some of those tensions? Because one of the things that came to mind for me, and I would but is, say, even in another organization around, and we used the example we shared just before the session around my partner whose disability means that she will often need an enclosed space because she's got a auditory dyslexia. But she's never asked for that, because what an enclosed space means in the world that she works in is privilege. And it would generate a whole bunch of conflict around, why does she get that space and why do I not get that space? And then there'd have to be this disclosure, or there's just a whole bunch of conflict that comes with trying to actually access what would help her perform better. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about managers who may face some of those dilemmas, and coaches in the same way around accommodating and being able to advance performance.
Yeah, and I'll give two examples. The first one is an athlete to organization example. So in the sports space that I was working in, because most of the decision makers, from my knowledge, were not people who identified as having lived experience with a disability, there were athletes who had a huge awareness of what they would have needed in that environment to make them successful. There was not a legitimate avenue and pathway to express what those accessibility, and we talked about the word accommodation even before this call, but let's call it accommodations, would have needed to be, as well as the ability to clearly articulate how that would be connected to performance. And one of the skill sets that I always think is needed in that space is the capacity to engage equally with a person who has got the necessary expertise to say, I think this is what the environment needs moving forward, and then the ability to put those pieces in place. And when I reflect on a lot of those situations where you'd be like, oh, there's an awareness of what this environment needs, we want to bring it forward and have a discussion around it, where the emotions and interpersonal piece came up was going, wait a second, you expect me to provide this, and that feels that feels beyond my role, right? Or I don't know how to provide that within my role, or I don't know how to have this conversation with you because maybe I'm uncomfortable about disability. And so then that essentially would have escalated that conflict and led to people becoming even further entrenched versus having a very like graceful and connected conversation about how can we move this forward. And then the other one was that it was a very like, you express your needs to me and I try and solve it. And if I can't solve it, then we essentially end up in a conflict space versus going, how can we change essentially what that style of leadership is and go, how can we work on this together? Because we believe that we have a shared expertise in moving this forward. So that was one example that showed up a lot, both in research, but also in my like lived, work experience in that space. The research really showed that the coaches and administrators had a really good understanding of what the funding structure should have changed to, but there was a lot of fear in expressing, let's try something different or let's try something new, for fear of losing funding or status or a role. And those are very legitimate things to be fearful of losing. And we're not in a space where we're going to judge whether somebody's fears are legitimate or not. It's more going, how can you move people who are in a conflict space to a space where they feel safe enough to take risks? And that involved a lot of partners and a lot of different understanding about who was accountable for what. And that was a very like clear piece to me through a lot of this research, was people don't necessarily clearly identify where they feel risk, nor is there safe spaces generated to express where they're experiencing risk.
There's so many things that you named there that are so interesting. And again, I just really invite people in the chat to jump in, because there's a lot of richness there. Or if you have a particular case that's on your mind that you'd like to contribute as an example. But when you talked about the interpersonal skills, about a manager or coach having difficult conversations that may involve feelings of discomfort for them, then there's also sometimes a fix-it mentality of by both the I don't know, we could call them subordinate, but athlete or employee and the manager coach, who so one, somebody may not even feel comfortable speaking up and saying, this is what I need to perform better. So there's already that culture, let's say, of inhibition. There's a sense of like, it's not safe for me to speak up or to take the risk. And you're saying, it's difficult to know, is that the individual that they've just internalized that in some way, or how can the organization create more, an organization is always individuals. How can people within organizations create conversations or open opportunities for those conversations, or to get that consultation and dialogue going? So there's the interpersonal part. Then there's also an awareness of sometimes it's a system itself, like a funding structure, that may limit performance for both the manager coach or the employee athlete. And to then think about, how do we change that systemically? That's a whole other skill set going on there. So those are some of the things that I heard, and I'm interested in where your mind is bouncing around now to respond back to some of your discoveries.
Yeah, the first one that I think makes me the most excited to talk about is your middle example about, I'll go into like, what skill set do people need to foster like self-determination, which is a huge part of conflict. And sometimes I laugh at myself because when I think about the values and principles of alternative dispute resolution, which really intermingled the CAM course, I would have never been open to them ahead of time. And it was like, that is not Samantha Heron and her values. And then as I sunk into them, I was like, wait a second, these are pieces that I love spending time in. And it's a space that I feel uncomfortable, but is a skill set that I really, really want to connect with. And then as you practice it, you're like, this makes a lot of sense. And the hardest one is, I'm also definitely a person who would employ a like fix it sort of skill set, when where we saw the most like success and engagement was in those spaces where you went, okay, let's support transparency, self-determination, and agency as you navigate through a conflict. And that's hard to do because you have to understand that I like to control, right? Like I'm a control person, and you're going, wait a second, my role here is not to control an outcome. It's like to work with people towards an outcome. And I do believe that that's a skill set that it's an important one to develop. It takes time and time in to develop. Or sometimes you need external support in navigating that through. And that's why I love working with mediators, learning about what mediators do, and then practicing in mediation and doing mediations. And so I really think that that's a missed skill set that a lot of places don't have. And it really clearly links to self-determination. And it's, we try and do a lot of solving without bringing along.
Right. So let's drill into that, because you've talked about the importance of transparency and agency. And so what are those skills more specifically about that can shift someone from a fix-it mindset into a bringing along mindset?
I think it's getting comfortable with the transparent conversations, and the really basic example I have is when we think about how we look at children in our society today, there's often this belief that children need to be shepherded, which is true, and that children can't hear all of the information. At the same time, children have a huge amount of awareness, and when you have those piercing conversations with a young child where they say the most obvious and direct thing, and in that sense you go, okay, why have I minimized this person's ability to engage in this topic without even asking them, right? And so when you think about a child watching their family navigate divorce and going, okay, I as a parent, how do I provide this environment for them? Where can you actually have that conversation with the individuals in your space, which include your children, and go, what do you think we should do here, right? And that's a very basic example, but that principle exists in all different spaces. And part of that transparent conversation is naming what's going on versus dancing around the conflict. It's simply naming this is the issue and topic that we're experiencing. I think people feel a huge amount of relief when that is named. And then go, what do you need to move this forward? And then this is what we can do. This is what we can't do today, but this is our solution to address it.
What came to mind for me, Sam, when you were talking as well, is there's such a fine line sometimes between transparency and blame, and that sense of oh, what do you this is just what the funders want. Sorry, I can't do anything. And that then holding the tension of, okay, so this is so I'm accountable in this way. I'm not accountable in that way. I'm going to do the best of my ability this way. And although we can't change the entire system, we might be able to do this. So there's a complexity that's involved with that. And I do think holding complexity, being aware of complexity is a really important skill for everyone, but particularly in the spaces that you're talking around the manager or the coach, and that being able to recognize their own role in relation to their employee or their athlete, and then in relation to the organization and all of their superiors and the people that they're accountable for. So that kind of systemic wisdom is something that I think we're only just now beginning to get our minds around.
Yes.
Unfortunately, there's no playbook. There's no kind of the level of sport now is so carefully thought up from development all the way to high performance, and we don't have the same level of managing or coaching.
Yeah, and where one of the things that really informed my thinking about it was connecting my lived experience as a young person. Is I found myself as a very young person in these roles where, given the structure of the role, I had inherently a position of power. At the same time, I was young and female identifying. So that was an interesting space for me to navigate in regard to my legitimacy, because I was on one hand, this role implies X. On the other hand, I show up as Y, and I know that will be interesting for other people to navigate. And that really changed my skill set on consultation and how I worked with people, because that was my solution to essentially perform my role while still, engaging and building and receiving trust from the people I worked with. And so I think that, it was a little bit forced, but I really enjoy that skill set. And I often, when I think about other people I work with who have these roles that imply a power dynamic, there are some people I work with that are so phenomenal at legitimizing, consulting, and inviting people in where they agree to and consent to do problem solving with them. And that comes with like the proper, I don't mean compensation just in regard to money, but it also involves the proper like compensation as you work through that.
Mm. Mm. Yeah. And when you're talking about trust, that's connected with risk taking in a very profound way, it seems to me. It also makes me think about another CAM, the conflict analysis and management faculty member who's done her whole dissertation on trust. It's just a fascinating topic. And so what have you learned about that relationship between trust building within organizations for people with disabilities who have had good reasons not to trust in the past?
I think that the first, the personal one is that I shared with you at the beginning of the call. Like I recently went through an experience of disclosing to an organization I was working with for the first time, like this is an accessibility accommodation that I might need. It was interesting in the sense that I felt incredibly valued by the organization I work for, and just had a really good, these are the basics, right? But like really good rapport with the people I worked for. And also I had like the boundaries in place in regard to clear language that was like, this sounds, pretty litigious, but like clear language drafted by council, clear understanding of, disability acts and what accommodations people are entitled to have. And that empowered me to have that conversation. It put some really clear goalposts on the conversation that I didn't feel like I was taking a risk, that an organization, they had to be able to receive it, right, based on like legislation. And so that's that, when you think about generating safety and trust, and I work a lot in policy, and sometimes I feel like a policy pusher. Policy only goes so far in the sense that you know how to implement it and how it sets up like boundaries, structure on all of those ancillary pieces. But those are some of the pieces that can be considered for trust building, and it separates, person from behavior. It supports an accountability framework, and it gives people almost a neutralized space to jump off from, right?
So there's a lot in what you said around when you chose to disclose. There's a personal rapport, and then you also, so that's the kind of the carrot, and then you also had like solid legislation. You had a lawyer behind you helping with that. This is what you need. And so you also had the stick of like, you had these rights that were that, and as you said at the beginning, you have a certain level of privilege that helps you actually use those and work on those in a way that it conveys not that you're a troublemaker, but that you're actually like an advance, you're clearing the space for other people to come behind you. So all of that, all of those skill sets in some ways then prevent conflict. So you're doing a lot of upfront work so that there isn't the gray zone afterwards, that you have what you've talked about is that sense of a shared understanding with then that sense of neutrality, which is really, I think, what a shared understanding is that we can both agree. And so there's not a lot of threat on either side. When you work in spaces with conflict, I imagine there's spaces that kind of thing hasn't been present. And I'm wondering if you can talk about that a little bit more.
Absolutely. And, the first piece I will add to my example is I felt like a quote unquote easy case, in the sense that there are contexts that are more complex or require more energy put into doing those things. that would not make it as easy and as light of a process as I just described. And I don't think that I can speak to those. I think that there are other individuals who will be much better positioned to speak to what is needed there. I've never really paid to give advice, but my general advice in that space is like consult first, practice having the transparent conversations first. So I think that that's important to clarify. And then, as I got a little bit off track, Marnie, remind me the next stage in this question is?
Yeah, and so because I got really focused on that too, it was so interesting. But it's the when you go into your workspaces where you're doing a lot of alternative dispute resolution, to use that ADR jargon, that there's conflicts which come from, well, just as you described earlier, where there's misunderstandings, where someone has tried to respond and then dropped it, or then it ends up being an interpersonal conflict. Someone hasn't felt comfortable with naming what it is that they needed, and then it's not there, and then there's some workarounds, and then there's conflict that emerges. I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about some examples where if there's some trends, or there's some things that might be useful takeaways for the people watching that they may want to think about as in your experience of working with conflict and diversity.
Yeah, so the spaces where I see things escalated the most are where people tried to solve without putting their hand up and saying, I don't think I have the skill set right now. And so you watch these spaces where you go, wow, people at the onset of raising this, which is usually after something has been like brewing for a long time, expected this type of response. You didn't provide that. And then you went down this track that's really escalated something. And then when you reflect on the unpacking of that, not only are you trying to get to like the root cause of that conflict, you're also considering a lot of damage that has been done along the way as we missed opportunities to, reposition or address it in a way that felt appropriate. And, there's two things, especially in the sports space right now, given the very legitimate examples and experiences of people that are being shared. So many conflicts are going to this incredibly litigious space, and it's created so much fear and so much like, I'm going to close up, I don't know how to respond, and I'm not going to give you a response until I feel like comforted by my counsel that I can give you one. And when you think about that, that completely loses access to the human aspect. And you further, distance yourself from a space where you could have consulted with somebody and asked them, like, how can we navigate through this together? And now you're in a space where people expect you to solve it because we've locked down our lines of communication, and you're going, I don't actually have this skill set. And so then in those spaces where I'm brought in, it's a lot of unpacking. It's a lot of unpacking before you actually get to the original matter. And so, the first piece is that we seem very afraid to bring in help. And bring in, somebody who can essentially guide people along the process, whether that's for a fear, I don't know if it's a fear of expense. Sometimes I think it really is a fear of acknowledging that skill set doesn't exist, because we have this expectation that if you're in a leadership position, you can do everything, which I'm in many leadership positions and I can't. And I love collaboration. And that really struck out to me from the CAM process, is where do we collaborate versus problem solve? And so it goes back to, okay, if you can't find that skill set now, can you bring in somebody early on to support you along the way? And that often minimizes getting to that really entrenched spot. But when you're in that really entrenched spot, I think that we forget how much due time is needed to explain and communicate clearly about what the available pathways are, and about, do we have a clear understanding of what occurred? And the biggest piece that I love about alternative dispute resolution is it's very centered on moving forward. And I'm a person who loves to like drive it into the ground of like what occurred. But when we understand and agree that, okay, we want to focus on moving forward, we need to have some understanding of what occurred in order to do that. Then it allows people to then, once again, I think the theme is agency today, say, yeah, I'm comfortable in engaging with a moving forward practice, right? But that communication and clarity on that exists. And I honestly think a big part of a conflict skill set is we don't talk about it a lot, and we have really high expectations that people have it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, often people, like, there's an expectation, and myself included, when I'm feeling the discomfort of conflict, I think, uh-oh, something's wrong. And it's actually not a bad thing to be holding that tension of conflict, to let something change. So the taking of the risk, the holding of the tension, the moving things forward, so that conflict is not a signal that something is broken and to be run away from. It's actually a signal that something needs to be addressed. So it's a shift in that way. And then when you're saying that there's an expectation that something gets changed, an expectation for accommodation. And as we've talked about, even accommodation has a sense of like, how do we help you become more like us? Like that sense of accommodation still sort of centers a kind of ability. And there's good, I'm sure there's people probably on this call who are using other words in a way that can be more enabling. Maybe they're all enablers, because as you said to me earlier before the call, is that there's a lot of invisible accommodations, like that I'm wearing glasses, or that the space is suited in a way that I don't even recognize that I am being accommodated in so many ways. So that's a sort of, when there's this request for change, and then it hasn't been responded to, and then the manager or the coach is then responding in a way that actually doesn't meet the need. And so then there's a sense of, this is actually, we're doing it. No, you're not. Yes, we are. And then the conflict, there's a whole bunch of conflict that goes on top of what the original incident was. So one of the key principles in conflict work is that to address it as soon as possible, because unaddressed conflict almost always escalates. And one of the challenges in organizations is that managers just kind of want to punt it or hope it goes away, and it never goes away. Those kinds of problems, they always get worse, because you say, then incident piles up on incident, and sometimes I don't have the skill set, may be overly vulnerable, and managers or coaches may not want to expose that kind of vulnerability. So where then might they be able to be comfortable in expressing that without it being a kind of letting themselves off the hook?
Right.
What skills are needed to be able to develop those kind of competencies?
Yeah, and I think when I mean, part of me is like, I really enjoyed my having access to education, that like the motivator for me, and we were laughing about this when we connected, Marnie, is that when I signed up for this program, I was like, I think I was at the deadline to apply, because I was experiencing a workplace conflict where I was like, I definitely don't have this skill set. And I'm really disappointed that the people around me who I expected to have a skill set don't have it. Recognizing now that I actually, not to pump my own tires, but I actually would have had it somewhere in my mind that moving forward is the way to go. And this is how I'm going to engage in moving forward. So one of them is like, when you reflect on your traditional ways of gaining expertise in a role, often it doesn't include having a conflict skill set. And so what are ways to get access to building that skill set? That's quite iterative with the work that you do, is one way of doing it. I also think that you learn by engaging with support as you go through that. And then it's really important for the people who currently have some power in regard to how roles are set up, to create space for that vulnerability to exist, to create space for somebody to say, wow, I'm navigating a problem in front of me that I didn't expect to, or on self-reflection, it's making me feel really uncomfortable, nervous, yucky, like all of those gut feelings. And where can I go to get like legitimate support for engaging with this without it being taken off of my desk? Because so oftentimes you're like, oh, I wanted to go over here to this department to have it fixed. And that's not actually going to save a relationship with that employee that you work with, or with that individual that you will have to continue to engage with. And I think that I was talking with somebody the other day where we have this like huge sense of urgency oftentimes in getting to a resolution, and like my experience is that a lot of this stuff takes a lot of significant time and significant energy to engage in. And also, I've never been a brain surgeon, and I won't be a brain surgeon, which means that the work that I'm doing right away, there's not a life at stake in this moment, right? There's not that emergency aspect to it. So how can I give it the appropriate like due care and attention, because we're not in an acute phase?
It's very interesting. So there's two questions that have come up for me. One is that we can also, that I've asked questions about that manager coach with that assumption that that person is able-bodied, which is, or in that space of like offering accommodation, which has all kinds of assumptions. But as you said, that's sort of more like it now. But then also the skill set to raise conflict conscientiously, I think, is a huge skill set that we often underestimate, because once again, with that bias towards conflict is troublemaking and there's a negative aspect to it. But the capacity to engage conflict conscientiously is another skill set that I think we do cultivate, and to build that capacity. The second thing that you've said about that ability to not prematurely resolved happens in mediations, as well as people are so uncomfortable that they want to come to some kind of quick solution, or without having fully explored either what the problem is, because that so much can be solved with actually a very full understanding of what are we trying to address here. The superficial and the moving on can sometimes really overtake that. But then also that, how can we allow the consequences to land where they need to? And that's also can sometimes be very, very uncomfortable.
Yeah. And the first piece that really comes to mind for me, and once again, I'll connect it to the CAM education, is that we went through that process at the beginning of the coursework. If anybody's ever looked at the syllabus, it's a huge amount of self-reflection. It's a huge amount of like personal experience. And I remember going through that work at the beginning and going, how intrusive is this, right? And why do I have to talk about these personal experiences? Because I expect to apply this to a professional space, and I have no interest in meshing the two. And yet, as I went through that process, I was like, yes, I can very clearly understand where I engage in a lot of avoidant and a lot of flight or fawning, like oriented conflict tendencies. I really understand how I show up in these spaces. It makes it really clear to me why I'm looking for a quick resolution. I don't want to be in this space anymore. I don't want to deal with the uncertainty. And having that, and it sounds so cheesy, but it's really not, having the capacity for self-reflection and building a skill set, and I'm nowhere near there yet, but building a skill set to go, okay, what am I feeling? How do I honor that? What are others feeling? How do we honor that? And what does that indicate about going through this conflict process? If we're minimizing a conflict that's in front of us and expecting it to go to a quick resolution, that probably means something else about not wanting to face it, right?
It's a huge shift to look at, to just even look at feelings as data. They're signaling that something is at stake, and it doesn't need to be a lot of diagnosing, but at least recognizing what is it that they're pointing to in me and in other people is a very useful strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. And one that we are often, especially coming from the sports space where you're so often instructed to turn off your mind and turn off your connection to your body. You're like, how do I, once again, like legitimize this in this space? And I think that that's a big part of working through conflict with people and looking at that skill set that people need to access.
So there's a question from my colleague, Eva Melisius, who asked about the values and experiences around to draw on for designing your process for engaging with the individual and the sport and the organization. So to talk a little bit about that process design when there is a conflict, it's a great question.
So this one has always changed for me based on the context, with, once again, centering back to a couple of the themes that I've been on today. And one of them is oftentimes when I propose a process to people about what they're engaging in, the principles of what is being proposed is explained. So, okay, we understand this is what the matter at hand is. This is how, like, these are the possible ways that it can be addressed. In the space that I operate in, it's either it won't be addressed, it'll be addressed through alternative dispute resolution, or it's going to be addressed through a complaint management mechanism. All of those imply different things, and clarifying that and how I present it to people is often what the initial proposal will look like. Then the next stage, once again, it goes to a little bit of consultation about how do people want to receive this information. It's as simple as, like, I'm a visual, I need a chance to, like, look through information and write written comments. And that's essentially the same way that Ariana posted an agenda today, that's my, like, navigation tool for moving through an item. Sometimes people really want to engage in a more discussion-like process. I've been a part of and invited into some really powerful circle processes, and watched the value of those emerge as people explored a conflict. And so it's giving space to draw on, like, safety needs, procedural needs, cultural needs, and then context specific needs in the development of an engagement, right, with somebody.
Yeah. As you say that, it goes back to those skills of how to be really authentically co-designing, where people are clear about, this is your role, this is my role, you provide input, or you have the agency to do this. My role as the conflict practitioner is I'm going to respond to that, knowing what I have to respond to as well. And we're going to design a process where you can have a way of feeling like you've been heard and seen, or that you're going to be able to feel safe and protected, whatever it is that matters most to you in this space. And that we'll design something that then responds to those needs while also giving the respondents their chance to do that. So there's the being able to have that complexity where you don't have to be the answer lady, but that you're actually providing the spaces for people to speak and be heard in a way that most responds to what matters to them.
Yeah, it's providing containers. And Dr. Walinga was my thesis supervisor, and my all-time favorite line is that complexity is not necessarily more complicated. And it's providing containers to look at complexity based on what fits within the scope of the context, which is like the most, like, I'm sure it makes sense to people, but it's the most, like, abstract answer. But you can apply those principles to, like, the specific nuanced conflict that you're looking at.
So what would be an example of how complexity doesn't need to be complicated? How do you provide when you say a container, what would an example of a container be that could do that?
Yeah, a really good example is thinking about the type of procedure somebody wants to have for looking through a conflict while managing cultural constraints, time constraints, budget constraints, and the requirement of, like, external partners and stakeholders. And so you're like, whoa, there's a lot of different pieces that we want to navigate through here. Through consultation, or through essentially problem solving with the most present parties, how do we essentially navigate through these items one piece at a time and create, once again, a space to talk through it. And then oftentimes what you're also doing in that space is figuring out, how do people actually communicate, right? And what are we learning here about how people are going to show up? And then that adds another layer to what we add. I used to love proposing the solution and the pathway, and I was like, this is how it's going to go. And I'm much more comfortable at going, this is our first step. These are the indicators that we're looking for from it. That's to advise what our next step is. And at this point in time, there's no guaranteeing an outcome.
That's a huge shift.
Yeah.
It's a huge shift. And why is that better?
once again, it gives more space to things to emerge,
Mhm.
which is a person, like I said, I'm a self-identified control freak. And so,
Mhm.
whoa, something new comes up. How do I address this versus how do I ensure I've got the capacity to expect that something new is going to come up?
Mm.
And then how do we go, that's actually an incredibly valuable piece of information that
Mm.
we wouldn't have gotten to without engaging in it.
Mm.
So sport is very, process, performance, outcome.
Mm.
And as you move towards an outcome, you realize that it's actually really easy to apply some of those principles to a conflict space and going, okay, what's our process? What are our, like, quote unquote performance indicators?
Mm.
And what does our outcome look like? I imagine our outcome will shift.
Mm. Mm. So in that way, I can really hear that you're combining the what's already comfortable in
Yeah.
sport, and then being able to apply that language of conflict engagement in a way that makes sense. And so, in a different context, it might be something quite different, but that you're able to draw on the strengths that already exist and then widen them so that, in addition to, because you're also talking about the other side of that, where there's sometimes that focus on process and performance and outcome can sometimes mean shutting down. We can't have it looking too messy. But if you turn it this way, then it actually opens things up, and it's uncertainty, but uncertainty isn't necessarily bad if we know what's taking us towards the goal.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, we are winding up. This has been an outstanding conversation. And as we've been thinking so much about the ability and disability space, there is also the much wider conversations that are always taking place around other forms of equity, diversity, and inclusion, whether it's around sexuality, whether it's around race and language and culture, that there's so many ways that we're seeking to grow towards a more equitable ways of interacting with each other as well as with land. And the skills that you've talked about in the conflict program, that they're yours, you develop them, and it's been everybody develops the skills that they need to be able to apply into their own workspace. And so I know Ariana wants to say a little bit more about the conflict program itself, but it's been wonderful for me to connect with you in more depth than we've had a chance to for
Oh,
quite some time.
yeah, no, I'm very grateful and appreciative to be invited into this space. So I'll pass it over to you, Ariana. But of course, I'm also happy to connect with anybody that wants to talk about the programming. I'll put my email in the chat.
Excellent. Thank you so much, both of you. That was such a wonderful, rich conversation. I know we'll get a lot out of that for people who are here and on the recording. So I will go ahead and just share my screen real quick again. Hopefully everybody can see that. Please let me know if you cannot. Yeah, so we'll tell you a little bit more about the conflict analysis and management program if you want to continue the discussion and continue the dialogue around conflict analysis and management. I personally find it very interesting myself. Some key dates to be aware of if you are thinking about maybe applying to the program. For the upcoming intake. The next start date is January 8th, 2024, and the application deadline is August 31st, 2023. So there is time, my friends. If you are thinking about getting an application in, we would love to see you. Of course, our website is the best resource for a robust understanding of what is needed to apply to the program. But just to give you a few tidbits before you go, there's first an online application fee of $131.39. And then we ask for some supporting documents, and those look like transcripts if you have them, a detailed resume, a personal statement, which is just really your understanding of why you want to come into the program, what you hope to get out of the program, and what you hope to bring as well to the table. And then a couple letters of reference too, and those can be from your workplace or from an academic context. So just a few tidbits to keep in mind if you're thinking of preparing the application. Start writing that personal statement. are preparing those documents. So we also have, of course, our enrollment services. I know Andrea, I believe I saw her on the line there from enrollment services, but they can be reached at just learn.more at royalroads.ca for any questions. If you're thinking about, program options or program information, really great resource to reach out to. They're happy to chat. That's just my little tidbits at the end. And with that, I will say thank you, of course, for tuning into the session. As I said, we did miss Alejandro, of course, but we will have him on in the future. Samantha, it was such a pleasure to be on the session with you. And of course, Marnie, it's always a pleasure to co-host with you. I will leave it to Marnie, if you'd like to maybe wrap us up with a few final words, and Samantha as well.
I'll just say that I was very inspired by the conversation with you, Sam, and to just go with those key words around transparency and agency and collaboration as the takeaway messages that I got for today. So thank you very much.
Excellent. And Samantha, any last words from yourself?
No, I appreciate a good summary, Marnie, on that one. And so yeah, very great. I've always felt very grateful to have access to my education, and yeah, it was really nice to go through a bit of a reflection process today because I haven't had that opportunity yet. So thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, both of you. And of course, we'll have some sessions coming up in the near future. So stay tuned for more details on those, and we'll see you there. Take care, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day or evening.